I'm joined today by Fernando Espuelas. He's the host and managing editor of the Fernando Espuelas Show on Univision America Radio Network. It's great to have you on. I actually listen to your show, which isn't always the case, with a lot of our guests, and it's really cool. You actually do your show partly in Spanish, partly in English. How do you decide which parts to do in which language?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for inviting me on your program. Our concept is that Latinos are predominantly now bilingual, and therefore we can go back and forth when it makes sense to do so, and we will not lose our audience. And in fact, that's what's happened. So what we do is we default Spanish, and because it's a Spanish language network. But when we have callers who are not comfortable speaking Spanish, we switch to English. Or when I'm interviewing a political figure, of which mostly they don't speak Spanish, we just switch into English. And that's basically the format. It totally depends on what we're talking about. And then there are moments when I forget Spanish for a moment, so I'll switch into English, and that seems to work okay as well.
Well, it's hugely interesting to me to do a show that is a political show that is mostly or at least part in Spanish, because the Hispanic vote is really becoming increasingly important and more of a topic of discussion going into the 2016 election and beyond. And I've talked about for years how there are demographic shifts at play in the U.S. right now that are going to make it really difficult for Republicans to continue the strategy of this over-reliance on the white vote. I mean, looking at 2016, Republicans, based on demographics, would need, it could be as much as 60 or 62% of the white vote if they don't gain some of the non-white vote. Where do you see this right now? And people you talk to, what is the primary issue that is keeping Hispanic voters away from voting for Republicans, with the exception, of course, of Cuban Americans, which are the most conservative of the different Hispanic groups in the U.S.?
Well, I think that I agree with your basic math that it's increasingly hard to see how Republicans win the White House without attracting a much bigger percentage of the minority vote in general, including African Americans, including Asian Americans. But certainly the Hispanic vote is a critical component because it is, although it's underrepresented in the voting, the overall numbers of potential voters is huge, and it's growing by 50,000 kids who turn 18 every single month. So the issue, I think it's a policy issue. I think that the Republican Party has shrunk to now be primarily an older. Obviously, there are other people who vote for them, but generally speaking, that's who it is. And they've appealed to this electorate primarily through a strategy of fear. In 2009, if you remember, the Tea Party movement, which was essentially created by consultants in Washington and then funded by some big money interest, a lot of their messaging was give our country back, give us our country back. And then bizarre depictions of Obama as either both a Nazi and a communist, with no apparent irony involved. So I think that the overall demographic change of the country is a factor. I think having an African American president is a factor. I think that the Tea Party moving the center of gravity of the Republican Party to the far right is a factor. And at the end of the day, what's happened, I believe, is that Republicans are in favor of immigration reform if you look at national polling. But when you get into the congressional party, which has been gerrymandered into these perfectly hermetically sealed, homogenous congressional districts mostly, that electorate may not only not want immigration reform, may feel threatened by it. And certainly the politicians have exploited that fear with a tremendous cascade of lies about illegals and they're robbing your job and they're criminals and so forth and so on. So I think that the problem is that the Republican Party does not have today, it seems, the will to fundamentally evolve its positions. They've lost 5 out of the 6 last elections in terms of popular vote. That's probably a signal that your program is not a program that can attract a national majority. But they go through this process where they decide they have to change, and when it comes to having to change, they default on essentially a messaging problem. We have a messaging problem. But it's not a messaging problem. When you have Mitt Romney in 2012 running on this, essentially this the harshest policy possible, self-deportation, old ladies and children out, will make their lives impossible until they leave. I'm an American citizen. It doesn't impact me. There's no one in my family who's impacted by a reform, but I was highly insulted by that rhetoric, and certainly the premise that you would be able to attract supporters, not just among Hispanics, but among Americans, independents and center Republicans, to what is a vaguely 1930s policy of displacement of 12 million people. I mean, it just makes no sense.
I think that there may also be another factor at play here. Always lurking in the background of all of these positions is the effect on fundraising, right? Because fundraising, because of our how elections are financed here, our fundraising is at the forefront. Is it possible that Republicans realize that they need to change their positions on immigration, maybe adopting something closer to what Jeb Bush talked about recently, saying, it's just not really feasible to say we're going to deport everybody. We should institute some kind of path to citizenship. But at the same time, they realize that their base, which is very much against anything even resembling amnesty, may stop donating money to them if they adopt that policy.
I'm not sure that's because the party, from my perspective anyway, seems to be divided among the grassroots, which are primarily blue class workers, older, downscale, lower education levels, and then the so-called establishment, which are primarily business interests. And the business interests, like, for example, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which has been essentially an annex of the Republican Party for decades, they're completely in favor of immigration reform. And why? Because it's very beneficial to business. And I think if you pull back, what is immigration reform? Forget the emotions. It is a fundamental shift in how we have to structure our country in order to be competitive for the next 100 years. If you just were to freeze magically the population that is in the country today, no more immigrants, legal, illegal, it doesn't matter. You would, in fact, have a declining population about 30 years from now. Said in another way, we would have a declining national economy, political structure, but our ability to project power internationally would go away. I mean, there are a lot of really fundamental issues here that immigration addresses. And then you can go up and down the scale. You can go to Silicon Valley and how, that engine of tremendous innovation really requires lots of immigrants, that we want to be able to hoover up the best minds in the world and have them come here without all the hassle, or if they're coming to our universities, to have them stay here. And then all the way on the other side of the labor market, the reality of it is, and this was put to the test in Alabama with the anti-immigrant law there, and Georgia the same way, that without immigrants who are essentially willing to do some very hard work that other people are not willing to do, the agricultural sector suffers tremendously. And then there's everyone else in the middle, right? So I think the issue ultimately is about ideology more than money, and I think that it's impossible, seemingly, at least that's what Romney experienced, to win the Republican nomination without taking this extremist position. And let's remember, Mitt Romney, of all the people on planet Earth who he could have picked to be his immigration advisor, he picked Chris Kobosh, who was the author of the Alabama anti-immigrant law, the Arizona anti-immigrant law, who has been writing voter ID laws to exclude Hispanics, and who can be traced to a group of white supremacist organizations. No, I'm not exaggerating. If you look at John Tanton, the John Tanton Network, there's a great New York Times piece that's worth reading, where it actually puts out all these huge groups of supposedly independent activists who are in fact all connected behind one strategy, which is to stop all immigration into this country. So, I mean, that was Mitt Romney's choice, and I think that whatever else you think about his politics, I don't think in fact, I think he's a very smart man, but at the end of the day, in order to get even close to winning the nomination, he had to assume some of these positions, which were ultimately completely unpalatable to, well, Hispanics certainly, but Asian Americans. They lost the Asian American vote by even a bigger margin than the Hispanic vote.
Fernando Espuelas Show on Univision American Radio Network. What's the best way for people around the country to listen to your show?
Well, if you have a Univision America station in your city, that's one way. But probably the best way is to listen online. You can listen to my show live on Euphoria, which is an app, a Univision app. You can download for whatever phone platform. You can also listen to iHeartRadio online, and also UnivisionAmerica.com streams the show as well. It's on from 2 to 4 Eastern time, Monday through Friday, and then it's all across the country.
Excellent. Fernando, you're from Uruguay. I'm from Argentina. I'm very excited for the World Cup, which is going to be happening soon. How are things looking for your country this time around?
Well, I think of I'm the one Uruguayan who does not follow soccer. So
so you'll root for Argentina then?
I'm going to root for the United States and Uruguay as well, and Argentina. I mean, at the end of the day, I learned early on that I will not attach my emotions to a bunch of guys who may or may not win, and I cannot control. So I'm not into the heartbreak experience of the World Cup, but I certainly will watch the finals.
All right, Fernando, really a pleasure having you on. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you, David. A pleasure being with you. Thanks for inviting me.